All right, we're live. What is up, everybody? We're gonna talk about something I haven't talked about in a while. Honestly, I haven't talked about anything in a while because I haven't streamed in a while. But we're back. We're going to be more consistent. I think I'm gonna start focusing more on the streams and on the videos. I feel like streams are just more fun, and I think that's gonna be the priority for the time being. Let me make sure that my mic's working. But yeah, with that said. Today's topic is Nietzsche. I found this video. I wasn't planning on talking about Nietzsche, but I was just scrolling through. I saw this, figured I would go through this because I think this is fundamentally one of the most misunderstood people is Nietzsche. Um, for whatever reason, I feel like he's fairly easy to read once you view it from a certain lens, but people like to impart their own belief systems onto him, and I think that's really the issue with it. That's really the issue with a lot of things. Why people can't understand things is you can't take it at face value. You have to impart your own perspective on it, and instead of listening to what the person's saying, but it's just me.
The first 100 people to use the link in the description ideas as possible membership, positioned at the forefront of perhaps the most significant shift in Western history, having both predicted the cause and consequence and going on to provide.
You could credit Nietzsche with predicting the fall of the West, but he studied Dostoevsky. Like he studied Faust. Like it's all there already. It's just maybe he formulated the ideas in a way that wasn't said previously, but I think the foundations of Nietzsche's belief system are all there. More or less, if you break down Dostoevsky's, like, if you want a central thesis of what Dostoevsky was trying to write, was trying to talk about, is that we have gotten away from caring about people, we've gotten away from institutions that matter, and what we've replaced it with is blind materialism, and it's an empty, hollow existence that we are now pursuing, and without a return to faith, without a return to liking each other, without a return to something much deeper, society is going to collapse on its head. Um, that's really what you could say about Nietzsche as well. I mean, that's really what God is dead means. It means that we have destroyed the institutions of enlightenment, the institutions that have uplifted humanity, and we've created systems of power. They're no longer things that you can turn to when you are downtrodden. You can turn to when you're having rough times and find inspiration, find the guidance, find the wisdom. Now it's become some place where you give them money and they tell you what to do. Um, and I think you could see a lot of analogous stuff between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, but I mean, ultimately, Dostoevsky's solution to everything is far different than what Nietzsche's was, because Dostoevsky said we need to return to a faith, we need to return to a church. I don't remember what church, probably Eastern Orthodox, but
Grandiose, revolutionary ideas as possible solutions. Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most influential and significant
by the way, I only speed it up because we're not going to get through 15 minutes for me is usually like 2 hours, so I'm going to speed it up just a little
thinkers
bit.
of modern history. The particular crossroads that Nietzsche stands at is one where the primary path of Western religious faith began to crumble and cave in, leaving a massive empty crater at the end of life's suffering, and what would
So, really, his commentary is trying to destroy the institutions and create something new. Because really, a lot of his writing is against nihilism. Because when you have nihilism, you have nothing. There's no point for anything. And if we have that, then we can't go on. We need to replace the old symbols, the old relics, the old things that once, inspired, great works of art, great works of poetry, great works of architecture. And we need to create something new. We need to give the individual something to believe in. And this is where you see ideas like the will to power or the Ubermensch or eternal recurrence, amor fati, like stuff like that, that is really, really harkening in on the individual.
seem like only one alternative path towards that of pessimism and nihilism. His life's work would undertake this newly emerging issue and attempt to forge a new third path away from both religious faith and nihilism and towards new meaning and human values. Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Saxony, Prussia, which is now part of Eastern Germany. He was born to a modest family living an ordinary, sheltered early childhood. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was the town's Lutheran pastor, which would immediately immerse young Nietzsche into the Christian faith.
Interesting enough, this is why you probably see a lot of the same beliefs in the writings, but Jung had a similar upbringing where his dad was. sister that kind of got away from the faith. I think Nietzsche's father died. I think that's the only difference. But they were both raised to be religious, and I think it kind of gave them this. Jung eventually came back to the faith, but Nietzsche never did. But it gave them this kind of rebellious nature against the status quo.
However, simultaneous to being introduced to it, it would soon be challenged and tested, as his father, the same man who practiced and preached of God, was diagnosed with a terminal brain disease. For a year, his father suffered horribly and then died at the young age of just 35. And the following year, Nietzsche's younger brother, Ludwig, also died. This dichotomy of his religious foundation and early exposure to the irreconcilable, reasonless pain and suffering.
He was also extremely sickly too, his whole life. So it's things you see with like other authors like Kafka, where Kafka was kind of sickly his whole life, and you can see it in writing. There's a certain mortality that's always carried throughout Kafka's stories, and you could very much tell that this is somebody that dealt with the idea of illness, the idea of sudden death, the idea of a bleak world. Um, you could certainly see its influences on the writing.
Experienced by good, undeserving people, would likely lay some of the groundwork for what would ultimately become the basis of Nietzsche's later work. Following a fairly somber, serious, and lonely childhood, Nietzsche would go on to study theology at the University of Bonn. Both in early schooling and university, he would show strong intellectual promise, excelling especially well in Christian theology. However, following just one semester at university, as he became increasingly critical and intellectually sharp,
Without his mustache, it's just like he was a guy that was carried by his facial hair. Let's just say
and
that.
after being exposed to various critiques of Christianity, Nietzsche would have no choice but to let go of his Christian faith, fully shedding the skin of his innocence and blind devotion. From here, he would go on to study philology, the study of the history of language, at the
He was like very well versed in ancient Latin and Greek, and how that kind of developed into the other languages. But it gave him a very under well versed understanding of ancient philosophy, obviously, because you're just around the stuff.
the University of Leipzig. Here, he would do so well that while still only in his mid-20s, he would go on to be hired as a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, becoming the youngest professor to ever be hired, still to this day. After only a few years of teaching, though, Nietzsche would leave his position, partly because of his growing
He was like somewhat a failed intellectual. So like I guess it's the same today, but more or less like if you're a professor, you kind of and then you publish stuff and then you become more and more well respected and it's just a cushy lifestyle for the rest of your life. But he never really um received the recognition that he deserved. And you can see this in his later writings, you can see this in his insanity. Um, maybe it was his health issues that developed his insanity, or maybe it was his inability to cope with the fact that he was one of the greatest minds to ever exist, and he was not appreciated pretty much at all.
dissatisfaction and sense of constraint within academia, and partly because of his growing poor health, which he had accumulated by a combination of genetic ailments and what is believed to have been a case of syphilis that he contracted at a brothel.
He frequented brothels. There's all types of theories. What kind of I don't care enough to look into it, but
From here, he would go on to live a fairly isolated life, traveling around Europe, moving to and from different climates most suitable for his poor health, and living off his small university pension. He would live primarily and most notably in the Swiss Alps, where he would spend the majority of his remaining sane life. Throughout this time, in between spells of being bedridden by his ailments, a devastating failed love ordeal, degrading friendships and family relations,
after after he proposed to this woman and she denied him, and then he wrote Let's Burg Zarathustra. So honestly, it's for the best that that didn't work out, because without that, I don't think we get Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is perhaps his greatest work. It's not my favorite, but you could definitely make the argument that it's his best. But it's written in pure allegory, and I don't, sometimes you don't want to. Sometimes you don't want to read allegory. Sometimes you don't want to read poetry. Sometimes you want to just read what he's trying to tell you, and that's why I like the gay science best. But those books are just not bad.
and depressive and nihilistic states. Nietzsche would spend most of his time walking, thinking, and writing, finding solace, meaning, and reason to continue through his pursuit of philosophy. During this time, he would produce his most influential works, including Human All Too Human, The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and On the Genealogy of Morals. In these works, Nietzsche would lay both the groundwork and early constructions of a new sort of philosophy, a philosophy that would essentially loosen the bolts of all contemporary
So Nietzsche's philosophy Summarized very simply is the destruction of everything except the self. Very Emersonian in some sort of way, but basically, if you want to think about Nietzsche, Nietzsche was not a fan of anything that limited the individual. Because think about it this way, like if I can be the best I can be, then I can uplift others the most. I can be as much of service as possible to the people around me, to society as a whole, and I can inspire others through my image. Very much reminiscent of Gandhi's quote, "Be the change you want to see in the world," that sort of idea. But basically, anything that held back the individual, Nietzsche was not a fan of, and he created these ideas such as the will to power, the Ubermensch, the eternal recurrence. He's going to explain them at some point, so I'm not going to go into them right now. But more or less, it's don't sell yourself short. Don't conform for the sake of comfort. Conformity is the worst thing you can do because it destroys all your power as an individual. And when you destroy your power as an individual, then you can be taken advantage of. Then you are not living your life to the fullest. Then you are wasting your time here on earth.
Certainties, all notions of good and evil, all knowledge of true and false, right and wrong. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned, has bled to death under our knives? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?
So I've not read it. I don't read interpretations of philosophers. I just read the philosophers. But I'm assuming there's a lot of people that think this is some grand atheistic statement. That's not what this is saying. What this is really saying is that we have strayed so far away from what religion was supposed to do. It was supposed to impart us with wisdom. It was supposed to prepare us for the afterlife, or if there's no life after. It was supposed to allow us to cope with these things. It was supposed to bring us together and foster a sense of community. But they've become centralized systems of power. They've become places that you can control people. They've become places of profit and no longer serve the same benefit. And really, what he's picking up on is that people are noticing this and straying away from these institutions, and they're replacing it with other ideologies. They're replacing it with whatever ism of the day, whatever religion or cult or government or system. Think of capitalism or communism. Think about how much people believe in one system or the other today. Is that not just replacing that place God once occupied? And that's really what Nietzsche was warning about, is that when we shift away from God, we're going to be shifting into ideas that will degenerate us and not uplift us. And this is where he comes up with his philosophy of the individual, his philosophy of it's inspiring not just yourself, but the world around you through your actions, through your inability, not inability, your lack of conformity, your adverse nature to institutions and systems of power, and going your own path and doing your own thing and being your own person.
This is perhaps one of Nietzsche's most quoted and important passages. It is in this line, God is dead, that we find not Nietzsche's celebration of humanity's lost faith, but his stark, intense concern of warning for what it meant. The collapse of Christian faith brought with it, in Nietzsche's mind, the collapse of everything built on it, the whole of European morality, its rationales, and its values. He both predicted and feared that with this collective revelation, without sufficient replacement, humanity would be left to struggle with no clear.
And again, this is what Dostoevsky's writing's all about. That's pretty much the central theme of all of Dostoevsky's writings, is that without this myth, this symbol, without this thing to aspire to, humanity will become lost and become meaningless.
Clear system or meaning and devolve into widespread despair in the form of nihilism. One of Nietzsche's key ideas at the foundation of his attempt to resolve this issue is the recognition that there is in fact no universal objective truth to be known. There are no facts, only interpretations, he wrote. Nietzsche denied the very concept.
So this is the Platonic idea of forms. And this is something I explain so much because it's so foundational to the way to view the world. So Nietzsche is very famous for these ideas. He did not originate these ideas. They're just an extension of the Platonic idea of forms, an extension of the cave allegory, things of that nature. But Bertrand Russell, this is a lot of his philosophy. Alfred Korzybski, this is a lot of his like the way we understand consciousness, the way we understand observation, the way we even understand like quantum physics and things of that sort. It's all based upon this idea that your interpretation kind of shades the way you see the world. You see the world through a lens, and it's based off of your experience. Robert Anton Wilson has a great way to explain it. What the thinker thinks, the prover proves. Um, an easy example, like watch the news, and based off what news station you're watching, it's gonna have that left or right spin on it. And it's the same set of facts, but it has a different spin. It has a different person to point the finger at, and it's purely based off of your worldview. We do this with things on a daily basis. You know, an easy way to see this is, describe the same object as somebody else. You might describe it in a way that 99% correlates, but there's that 1% difference. And in fact, we're using different words, we're using different symbols, we're using different frameworks to define things, which makes things appear differently. So this is really what Nietzsche is saying, is that there's no such thing as absolute morality. Every single morality is contradictory. In order for there to be peace, there had to be a war to ensure that peace. The safest nations are the ones that have the biggest military, like that sort of idea that, you know, almost as Orwell said, slavery is freedom. It's that sort of idea of things.
Constructive any sort of capital T truth, and suggested that all attempts to find one were woefully misguided and actually the source of disconnect preventing modern man from rediscovering any meaning in life. The pursuit of universal objectivity, or meaning beyond this life, took the spirit out of the present earthly human experience of meaning, which is inherently subjective, independent, and expressive. Because of this, Nietzsche would direct his attention primarily to the arts and humanities, believing that creative acts and experiences, be it things like music, philosophy, literature, theater, and so on, could be used as essential means to communicate deeper truths and fill the void of higher connection and meaning. Although, as Nietzsche explored this theory, he would find that cultural arts and humanities were susceptible to becoming dried out, academic, and/or commodified, often.
So what he's saying here is probably what's happened today. Think of art. Like, I'm sure we've all seen those videos of like doing like there's the guy that taped a banana to a wall, and that was like a $12 million piece of art. Like, that's nothing aside from money laundering. And there used to be a day and age where art was beautiful. You can't look at the works of Da Vinci or Rembrandt or people like that, or even the Gothic or Renaissance churches, and you're just like in awe. I mean, even if you don't like that style of art, you still have an appreciation for it. Whereas now art is subjective. Like even the movies that are coming out today that are spent, like they spend 300, $400 million, making it, budgeting it, marketing it, all sorts of stuff like that. Like, they suck. Like, you can watch any superhero movie that comes out today, literally just watch Blade or watch Spider-Man 2. They're way better. And like, that's not even high art. I'm not even talking about like, you know, uh, what is it, like The Godfather, or a movie that's, supposed to be one of the greatest movies ever. Like, I'm just talking about overall quality. Like, a throwaway movie back then is 10 times better than anything that will come out today. And it's like, there's certainly a decay in art, and I think it's somewhat emblematic of society. Like, if you want to see where a society is going, if you want to see how intelligent, how well versed, and how just well mannered a society is, just look at the state of the art. And it's really funny to think in the 60s, people were up in arms about "I Want to Hold Your Hand" when the Beatles sang it, and now we have Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion with their song. Um, and again, you can do whatever you want, but it's like the fact that that stuff's so popular should just tell you all you need to know about it. Like, you should just see that there is clearly a degeneration. And the issue that I think is coming to a head today is that the solution is not black and white. Like these problems don't get solved by one answer. It's like a collective answer. It's like things get better as a whole, and things will slowly improve. Like, as Khalil Gibran says, every sorrow deepens your joy. There needs to be a push-pull to life. Without this resistance and this ebb and flow, there's no progress forward. You have to fail before you can succeed. And I think we're in one of those downturns that on the other end of it are going to really signal a very interesting period in humanity, especially for the arts. I think it's going to, I don't know how to say this aside from like, you had the Great Depression, then you had America bounce back after the Great Depression. I think it's going to be very similar in cultural kind of artistic means.
And losing their luster and dependability. From here, he would turn his attention towards creating a philosophy that detached the individual from dependence on any collective experience or cultural mechanisms, and rather focused on the individual pursuit of creative expression and subjective greatness, placing the creation of meaning squarely in the hands of each individual.
So this is existentialism summed up very simply. That you define your meaning, that you define your value, you define what makes a good life. You don't rely. I don't think any one ism is the answer. I don't think you can call yourself an existentialist and have the whole thing understood. I don't think you can call yourself a nihilist or stoic or whatever it is and be completely balanced in your opinions, but at least it's something.
This philosophy
Most people need some framework. Most people need to call themselves something, and that's really against what Nietzsche's saying. The moment you have to call yourself something, the moment you have to define yourself by other people's terms, is the moment you limit your own potential.
would be embodied in what Nietzsche would term the Übermensch, or Overman, or sometimes
All right, so the the Ubermensch is put very simply. The Ubermensch is the idea that if you were by anything, if you were unbounded by the pull of society, if you could do everything you wanted to do and act as your idealized version of yourself in every moment, what would you be? So, like, you're trying to start a business, and at every turn you make the right decision. What could happen? That's essentially what the Ubermensch is, and that's what Nietzsche really wants you to aspire to. And it takes a certain level of strength. It takes a certain level of fortitude to, in spite of the whole world around you telling you you can't do something, to go do it. That's really what the Ubermensch is. Um, I don't necessarily enjoy his like. I think people have said it better. I think Emerson says it so much better in Self-Reliance. If I haven't talked about it, the Nietzsche and Emerson, they're not often associated, but they are very similar in their beliefs. But I think Emerson has a much better interpretation because it's much more inspiring, whereas Nietzsche is more confronting. And that's really a lot of the issues with his writing is that when you read him, it feels like you're being slapped in the face, and some people enjoy that and some people hate it. So, like, if you're somebody that is very sensitive, reading Nietzsche might not be for you because it's going to force you to confront yourself. It's going to force you to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I haven't been doing this, and this right. I've been failing to become all I can be. I've been conforming. I've been making decisions based out of fear, not based out of my own decision. And whereas Emerson's like, to be yourself in this world is the greatest of achievements. Like, there's a huge difference, and there's a very, it's, that's,
translated as the Superman,
I
which
don't
he would
think I have to
first
say
introduce in
anymore.
his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The Overman is described as a sort of defiant, confident
It was mentioned in the gay science too. I don't think it was, maybe it wasn't coined. Maybe the term itself wasn't coined in the gay, but I know it was in the gay.
independent individual who pursues their personal desires with vigor and dignifies their independent beliefs unapologetically. One who deviates from the collective, exhibits strategic selfishness, and acts with aggressiveness and grandiose. The reason for such characteristics was justified in Nietzsche's view by the fact that a new morality that opposed the moral views rooted in Christianity, which praised weakness and modesty, was needed to better suit the natural condition of human experience, which he felt was comprised and requiring of the desire for vigor, power, and greatness. This view is not without valid critiques and invalid misinterpretations. However, perhaps what is
Most people misinterpret it. If you think about it from an Emerson perspective, I think it makes a lot more sense. But if you read Nietzsche's language, sometimes it's so biting, sometimes it's fiery that you can kind of misinterpret it. It kind of makes you mad and makes you not want to agree with him.
more important than Nietzsche's image of the Overman is what the concept serves to represent. In slightly broader terms, Nietzsche sets up the Overman to function as a sort of idealized version of oneself, an image of a perfect and powerful being who has overcome all their fears and deficiencies, which one can and should set goals to strive towards. Of course, as an ideal, it cannot ever truly be reached, but that is functionally the point. Nietzsche proposed that the world, including the human, operates off of what he called the will to power, an insatiable desire in each living being.
Okay, so the will to power, I don't know if this is a controversial belief. There was this, ironically enough, I have a video pulled up for this guy. There was another philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer who very much inspired Nietzsche very early on in his career and in his reading. And eventually, Nietzsche kind of broke away, and this is him kind of answering a fundamental flaw he saw in the will to live. But basically, Schopenhauer coined this idea of the will to live, in that every individual kind of acts against their own self-interest, and it's this guiding principle that's kind of a self-preservation aspect of life, and it's why people go and commit crimes. It's why people go to war. It's why all these more negative things happen. It's because we can't see beyond ourselves. We can't see that this art thou. That's one of Schopenhauer's most interesting ideas. But um, really, that was like his framework for the world. And when you could break free of the will, then you could expand yourself into something far more interesting and far more compelling. But if you didn't break free from this, then you would forever be forced to toil away and be driven by this force that really isn't your own idea of itself. But Nietzsche wanted to expand it a little more. Um, Ironically enough, too, this is a lot of Freudian psychosexual theory too. But to me, I think Freud just kind of stole a lot of stuff. But like he popularized it, so he's important for that reason. But basically, the will to power is an extension of this idea in that you don't just want to survive, you want to expand your sphere of influence, we'll say. And easy example of this is, let's say that you know somebody that can get you a job and they get you a job, and you really can't do anything for them, but they give you this favor. Did that person do that for the kindness of their heart, or did they do that to kind of show how powerful they were? And Nietzsche argued that there was some argument that they just wanted to kind of flex their show off their wings, show off their feathers, and kind of peacock in a certain way. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just the need for organisms to kind of dictate their existence in this world. And I don't see a difference between the will to live or the will to power. I think there's an element of the will to live in the will to power. It's just the differentiation. You can argue semantics all day long.
being to manifest power. The world is will to power and nothing besides, he wrote. And according to Nietzsche, this will to power is manifested in the desire for personal growth and satisfied in the pursuance of said growth. It is important to note here that his notion of power is not necessarily referring to physical strength nor power and dominance over others, but rather power over oneself. Psychological and spiritual strength in the form of self-mastery and continuous growth represents the ultimate synchronization with the will to power for Nietzsche, and
And when you hear will to power, it sounds like somewhat Machiavellian. It's not necessarily a negative thing. It's just like an aspect of existence. Think of power as like your want to become good at something, your want to kind of have control over your own destiny, that sort of thing. And obviously, it can expand into a Napoleon or a Julius Caesar, that kind of person that wants to take over the world literally. But just think of it as like getting proficiency. Freud in psychosexual theory, he had this we've all heard the term libido, and we just think of it as sex drive, but there was an element to the libido that was the humans need to be respected for something. Humans need to be associated with some little proficiency and respected for that proficiency in some endeavor in life. Think of like people that like haven't been recognized. Think of people that like are unsung heroes that they're at their workplace and they do everything, but nobody gives them the time of day. Like that sort of person, like there's a fundamental need for that person to be recognized, and that's more or less what this idea is.
thus the ultimate synchronization with life itself. The desire and striving towards the ideal of the overman serves as perpetual fuel to this process of self growth, as one works through a continued cycle of self dissatisfaction, self improvement, and self rediscovery over and over. For Nietzsche, this process, which he would term self overcoming, is fundamental to answering and resolving the problem of meaning and value in life. So long as one establishes their goals of growth in the name of what they deem an idealized, life affirming version of themselves, the process transmutes the suffering of life into something worthwhile and personally redeemable, a sort of alchemy of the spirit that affirms life.
Again, you could tell that Nietzsche studied Faust. You can tell that he studied like everyone, pretty much every one of these like German or that sort of area of the world studied Faust and was inspired by it, and pretty much all of their works are derivative from that one work. If you're interested in any of these ideas and you've studied any of these people, it's definitely worthwhile to read Faust. It's very interesting work. And you'll see a lot of the seeds of some of the most important ideas that are accepted today in them.
Life in the face of its inevitable suffering. If we have our own why in life, we shall get along with almost any how, Nietzsche wrote.
If we have our own why in life, we shall get along with almost anyhow. Again, this is an existentialist wet dream, assign meaning to the world. that if we have a purpose, then we can work towards that goal, we can get towards that thing, and regardless of whatever is on our path, we can overcome it.
Unlike his primary predecessor, Arthur Schopenhauer, who proposed that suffering is best minimized and avoided to the best of one's ability, Nietzsche argued that suffering is, rather, a good thing to be leaned into, embraced, and used as fuel towards the.
I don't know if Schopenhauer would agree with that because Schopenhauer was very much in favor of the ascetics, which, if you don't know what asceticism is, I hope I said it right. Asceticism is like fasting and taking a vow of silence and living like a monk. Um, and you could term that as suffering, but Schopenhauer might not. But like, I don't think Schopenhauer said avoid suffering, avoid like the worldly suffering is what he would say.
Amassing of strength and psychological power. Life is in fact inevitable suffering, and so it is not a matter of
One of Nietzsche's most famous quotes is, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger."
if, but for what. The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind so far.
The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse of the that lay over mankind so far. So if you can find purpose to your suffering, then it's worthwhile. So think of it this way. Let's say you have a goal, let's say you have something you're working towards. You fail 1,000 times, but you eventually succeed. That suffering is now worthwhile because it got you to where you were going. But let's say like your life just becomes a mess one day, it's thrown into shambles and all these bad things happen. Like, is that, do you see the end to that? Do you see the purpose for that? Like, if you see a purpose for the suffering, if it builds you to become stronger, then it's not difficult to overcome. But prior to that, then it is. The AI voice is bad. It's not AI. It's just sped up. You'll hear it.
Nietzsche wrote. While continuing to write and live an increasingly isolated life in the mountains,
Yeah, this isn't AI. If it is, it's pretty good. It's just I just think the guy's low energy. But what's up, Pippin Audio has everything, man.
still in the early stages of some of his most ambitious philosophical undertakings, Nietzsche would begin to show increasing signs of declining mental health. At 44 years old, after seeing a horse being flogged in a street by its owner, he
So this is not necessarily true. Somebody I said this in one of my videos at one point, and somebody like gave me this long-winded paragraph, and I really liked it a lot because basically said it was there was this one journalist who was trying to discredit Nietzsche, um, and that's really where the story comes from. So I don't know if it's true or not. It may be true. It may not be true. Maybe the madness wasn't caused by a single event. Obviously, this is like a story that like makes him seem crazy. So like, take it with a grain of salt.
experienced a mental breakdown, rushing over to the horse, hugging and consoling it, and yelling, "I understand you, I understand you." This strange episode, which marked his last moments out of apparent lucidity, appeared to be an act of complete contradiction to his own philosophy: pity, weakness, and compassion.
Yeah, you deleted
Soon
it
after,
was a good
Nietzsche would
message. I was
dip
about to
into
read it, and
complete
then you deleted.
madness, eventually falling into a state of catatonia. One of the most powerful minds of modern history.
He was like basically bedridden for 11 years. Um, I think he died at 55 and he stopped writing at 44, which is young for an author. Jung was writing some of his best works like, I can't remember if he was 80 or 90, but right before he died, he was writing some of his most influential works. So
Seemingly collapsed under the weight of itself. Whether the cause was organic, latent consequences to his contracted ailments, or the consequence of a mind that pursued too far into itself, becoming stuck on its way back out, is unknown. Before ever coming back out, in 1900, at the young age of 55, Nietzsche died of a stroke. During his lifetime, according to his own standards, Nietzsche might likely be considered a failure. Prior to losing his sanity,
he certainly would be considered a failure, and I'm pretty sure he considered himself a failure. You can see actively as he goes on writing, his writing becomes less and less inspiring and more aggressive and confronting. And you could just say this is an evolution of his style, perhaps that's the case, but to me, it reads like somebody who is kind of dissatisfied with his lot in life. And it doesn't necessarily like discredit everything he wrote, but I think in certain ways it makes his writing less inspirational and appealing to a wider audience. Nietzsche burned out right before he did anything. Maybe. I mean, I wonder, like, sometimes, like, the shortness of life kind of makes it more meaningful. You know what I mean? Like Kafka, if Kafka didn't die when he did, maybe his writings wouldn't have been published. So, like, it's the thing of like sometimes, like, actually, it's not sometimes. It's like pretty much every time when a rapper or singer dies, like, they become more profitable for the record label. There's a whole super weird video on that. That go look that up at some point. But it kind of like raises their status. It kind of makes them more well known. So in a certain way, I think it aided his legacy. But again, would you rather be alive or famous after you're dead? I think I'd rather be alive. But
He had made very little of himself and saw very little, if not no success. His books didn't sell, and he never really garnered any notable respect or recognition. But following his death,
he was way too ahead of his time. That's why. Um, Even now, when people read him, they don't understand him. Um, Literally, just go read any reviews of his books, and you'll see that people don't get what he's saying. They're just imparting their own screwed up worldview onto it, and just yeah, the writings of a young, aimless, do nothing does make people famous.
of course, his work would take off, soon gaining massive notice, respect, and worldwide following, some of which unfortunately would lead to horrible, misguided, and ill-conceived applications. However, today, and more generally, Nietzsche's work remains potent, important, and redeemably ingrained in modern thinking. His quotes, aphorisms, and ideas echo through culture every day, both literally and symbolically.
Was it Britney Spears that used "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger" in a song? That's the greatest Nietzsche reference ever.
And so, in a fittingly ironic way, just how Nietzsche suggested that we must symbolically die throughout life so that we can get out of our own way and become who we really are, sometimes sacrificing ourself, our personal preservation, health, or sanity in the process of something greater. Perhaps Nietzsche's life and death was just that, a process of self-overcoming, towards self-sacrifice, towards something greater. Of course, Nietzsche's ideas aren't without valid critiques, including this notion of self-overcoming, sacrifice, and
You're
greatness.
being mean. When are you not being mean? No, I'm just kidding.
Although his assessments and predictions of modern issues are arguably quite accurate, his resolutions aren't necessarily all serving.
The biggest criticism of Nietzsche is that he failed. He wrote all of these extremely inspirational things and failed in the end. And that's the greatest criticism of him, is that he couldn't take his own advice. That's really the big issue with him. It's like the idealism of youth versus what is possible, not just in mind, but in time and place. Yeah. No, I agree with that. Dude, it's like so funny how like people will say, "Oh, this policy or this isn't realistic," and then they'll say something even more insane and even more idealistic, and you're like, "Do you not see the contradiction there?" Like everyone and their mother has this grand solution on how to solve the world's problems, and it's like, if it was that easy, wouldn't someone just do it? Like, like why out of everyone in this world do you think you can solve not just your problems, but everyone else's? Why don't you just start with your problems? I think that's really the main issue with everything, is that people want to say, well, if the world got better, then I would get better. No, no, you get better first. You work on yourself first, and then see what you can do then.
Is suffering and the continual pursuit of desire and self-destruction in the name of growth towards an unattainable end goal really a good thing? And how can one see it as a good thing if they do not? How can one create a life-affirming interpretation of life if their interpretation of life is not affirming? In other words, if one sees life as negative or meaningless, to try to create goals or place themselves on such an interpretation.
There's honestly like there's a certain beauty in, I wouldn't call it nihilistic, it's the absurdist worldview, we'll call it, but beauty in not putting meaning into life. Um, think about it this way: if there was meaning, if there was a set destiny, then you would have to do that thing. but because you have the ultimate choice, because in every moment you can respond how you want to respond, then you can live the best life according to yourself. But if there was a set meaning, that would mean you'd have to do something. It would mean that your destiny was set in stone and that you would have to follow these steps. And if you failed, then you were a failure. But what determines the quality of your life is you. And that's to me one of the most interesting ideas. That's Camus. Not
only brings them back to square
how I
one,
understand Camus. Maybe he didn't say that directly. I
in
can't
need of
remember.
some truth or meaning beyond themselves, something other than what one sees, has, or experiences, which they cannot have. And furthermore, if one does not agree with the initial premise that suffering is good in the name of progress, then the rest might merely be misdirection. Of course, being a philosopher whose work doesn't necessarily follow any linear or systematic structure and can even contradict itself at times, Nietzsche's ideas
It doesn't necessarily contradict itself because to be contradictory, Nietzsche would have to be a holistically like straight and narrow person where he wasn't. So I don't think it's contradiction. I think Nietzsche is more of a he's really more of a poet than he is a philosopher, and that's what makes him so interesting to me, especially. But if you're somebody that kind of is on the fringes of things, if you're somebody that kind of teeter-totter, of course you're going to be contradictory. If you don't contradict yourself, then you're not a person. Like think of any person ever. If they don't contradict themselves, then they're not alive. They're a robot. If the ideas exist, he expressed the groanings of a time yet come, because he was the first to notice them. Time had come. Time is fleeting and must be sown for a season and reap for a life. Yeah, it's an interesting way of putting it. But he actually did, like, he didn't. I hate when people say that he predicted the fall of the West. Like Dostoevsky did that first. Like, and I'm sure somebody did that before him. I'm sure there was someone else that captured the same hopelessness. But like, you can't read Crime and Punishment and not just say like, yeah, this is where Nietzsche got a lot of his stuff from. Like, you know what I mean? Maybe he didn't get it from there, but it echoes the same sentiment. And it's like there's not really anything new under the sun. I mean, we could trace most of these philosophical questions to the death of Socrates or the Platonic idea of forms or the cave allegory. Like it's all the same questions that are being answered time and time again.
are open to multiple interpretations. And of course, all the aforementioned is merely a single, very brief one. And more importantly, seeing as how his philosophy caters to this open-ended nature and is arguably not a guide to think in a certain way, but rather a guide to think in one's own way, Nietzsche leaves us the space to, even if we disagree with him, do just as he did and pave a new direction for ourselves.
Yeah, this just goes into an ad read. Exactly. Poetry captures feelings and emotions of momentary experience. It is a reflection or a projection of the interior. It's an interesting way to put it. I would definitely agree with that. Because I have this video of Schopenhauer pulled up, but I don't want to talk about Schopenhauer right now. I feel like Schopenhauer is interesting, but it's just like I like the idea of Schopenhauer, and then when I start thinking or talking about him, I'm just like, all right, this is kind of like it's like an interesting insight, but what do you do with it? That's what I feel like to me. Hmm. Let's talk about Kafka.
Franz Kafka is
I feel like Kafka and Nietzsche are very similar in the sense that they both died somewhat young, especially into a career of a writer, and they both died unknown, but one accepted it and one didn't. And I'll tell the story of Kafka's last work. Actually, I'll tell it later because I need some context that will make it more meaningful.
regarded as one of the greatest literary figures in recent history. He is known for his uniquely dark, disorienting, and surreal writing style, a style
The thing is Kafka's writing dark, or was that just the way he saw the world? And is he reading into it, or is he just showing you what he sees? What I mean by this is there's this very famous story of Kafka's neighbors like complaining about how he was maniacally laughing well into the middle of the night, like at 3 or 4 a.m. when he would sit at his desk to write these things, he's laughing hysterically. So it's like, are they really as bleak as you think, or is he just kind of having fun with it? Is he like George Carlin laughing as the world burns down, like that sort of thing?
And quality so particular to him that anything that resembles it has come to be known and referred to as Kafkaesque. To understand his writing and the qualities of Kafkaesque, it is helpful to understand his early life. Kafka was born in Prague in 1883 to a man named Hermann and a woman named Julie. His father was a highly successful, well-to-do businessman who, through sheer force of will and a brash, aggressive personality, managed to rise from the working class, build a successful business, marry a well-educated woman, and become a member of higher middle society. As parents tend to do, Hermann hoped for a child that would measure up to his ideal stature of a person.
Kafka did not. Kafka was like a very sickly boy, and he was sickly like even into his adulthood. Um, like kind of tragic because it was like his whole life he could never quite catch a break. But
Franz Kafka was not that. Franz was born a small, anxious, and sickly boy, and he mostly remained that way. As a result, through no fault of his own, Franz would become a great source of disappointment for his father and a sort
he was like I think he was like a lawyer for a insurance company, and he kind of did it, and like he was just there. He really excelled. He was never really like he made good money, but it wasn't like he was a millionaire and he had the freedom. He still had to work a day job, and in order to write, he had to stay up late into the night. And if you read any of his letters, if you read any of his journals, you can tell he's a man unsure of himself. He was a man with great talents, and part of him knew that, but another part of him wasn't willing to take the risk. I don't know if he's going to tell it. I'll tell the story of perhaps his greatest childhood trauma, and you can see this in a lot of his writing.
of psychological punching bag for him as he attempted to mold Franz into who he wished he was, but could never be. Throughout his adolescence, Franz developed an urge to write as a means of dealing with his increasing sense of anxiety, guilt, and self-hatred. Of course, his father did not allow him to pursue writing and ultimately defined the borders around Kafka's life, forcing him to pursue law as a profession. During his time
You tell your mother all the time, "Mother, I'm dumb." Why does that come up? Like, I'm confusing the context here.
studying law in college, Kafka continued writing and met one of his only real friends,
So this is the guy that he's always gonna say, but this is the guy that published all of his writings after Kafka died. So while Kafka was alive, he had published stories, but they were just in like journals. They really weren't anything of note. They really weren't popular. This was back when like people would have short stories published, and it was like a thing to be published, and you could get discovered, and then you could become like it was. We were much more literate back in the day. I don't even know if they still exist, like collections of short stories of like unheard authors and stuff. Maybe it does. Maybe it's just way underground. But basically, Kafka only published a few stories during his lifetime. No success. No one knew his name. And then in his will, he told this guy to burn everything that he'd ever written. And this guy took these things and published all of them. And within the next 10, 20 years, Kafka was the known as the greatest writer in all of Europe. It's so funny. Tales all this time, ability without stomach for risk. Yeah. Now that's I wonder how many people lived and died like Kafka. Like had great potential, but didn't have the conviction to face their fears, didn't have the conviction to, slay that dragon, metaphorically speaking. But yeah, this guy took everything and published it. And there was even this weird theory I saw, which I don't give credit to, because it doesn't make sense. Like I don't know anything about this guy's upbringing, but all of Kafka's writing, you can kind of read into it and look at his personal life and see where this experience comes from, see where he's writing this from, what perspective it is. Like there are a whole lot of daddy issues in Kafka's writing, but some people believe that this guy actually wrote everything Kafka wrote and he just didn't want to take credit for it. But I don't believe it, but
Max Brod, Another writer who would eventually convince Kafka to publish his first
Nietzsche's last words were, "Mother, I'm dumb." So I didn't know that. Those are pretty good last words. Some people have some funny last words.
three collections of work. These pieces sold very poorly, however, and essentially went unnoticed. After college, Kafka would go on to work in a law office and then for an insurance company. Here, Kafka would become subject to long hours, unpaid overtime, massive amounts of paperwork, and absurd, complex bureaucratic systems. Kafka was, understandably,
This is where perhaps his greatest work comes from, The Trial. If you haven't read The Trial, one of the greatest novels ever written, and it's unfinished. That's how good. But basically what the trial is about, and this is me trying to sell you on the trial. You really need to go pick it up. There's actually a website. It's like franzkafka.com or something. Some guy published everything. I don't know. I'm assuming it's in public domain. Before I mention it, I think it's public domain. Kafka died in 1916 or something around then. So you're free to. It's definitely on Project Gutenberg or whatever. But basically the trial is about this man who's arrested one day, and the entire book he's going to try to discover why he was arrested, what he did wrong, how he can get out of this case, just try to get information. And he goes to all these different people, he goes to all these different systems, and really, what you discover is that all these people have a pull on justice, and can we ever have justice in a society of people? Because people are infallible. People inherently have an ego, and that ego can pull things in a different direction. Very Kafkaesque of him. God wants us to put to good use talents he has given us. Yeah.
miserable. While working at the insurance company, Kafka continued writing on the side, producing some of his most notable pieces, including The Trial, The Castle, and America.
I don't like the castle. And I love Kafka. To me, it has the funny elements of America and the brutal bureaucratic nature of the world of the trial, but it does both worse. So like I would rather him do one or the other. That's just my perspective. Apparently it's his most mature novel. I really don't agree with what a lot of people say about books. Avoid the legal system at all costs. Yeah, I mean it's a system. It's like everything. I don't think I think when systems go on for too long, they inherently become unjust, and that's a whole other philosophical argument. But I just don't participate. I mean, that's really the greatest thing you can do. Like, you know, whoever you vote for, you're getting John McCain. It's history will prove that statement more right every time. I think Jimmy Dore said that. I think that's the best way to put it. People are sculling you. And George Carlin has a great quote. I love people as individuals, but hate them as groups. And I think that is the most accurate statement about humanity that has ever been said.
He did not attempt to publish any of these at the time, however, and even left much of his work unfinished, believing it to be unworthy. Kafka
All of his novels were unfinished. That doesn't mean you shouldn't read them, but if you're going to read one of his novels, read The Trial. That's the best one. But the other ones, The Castle doesn't really have an ending. I don't really care if a book has an ending or not because it's life. There's not really an ending to life unless you die. So I'm fine with the book not having an ending, but America's like it sucks because it kind of just leaves off in the middle of a sentence. Like it just stops. And you're like, I want to see where it goes. So it's kind of unfortunate for that, but
continued working at the insurance company for the majority of his remaining short life, while continuing to write around his work schedule. In 1924, he died of tuberculosis at age 41. Kafka never went on to publish any more of his
thank you, Hypnodio. Thank you for the super chat. You didn't have to, man. I always feel weird. Like I just want to like it's fun hanging out with you. You always say interesting stuff, but like never I know I always appreciate you, Hypnodio. Just know that. Um yeah, thank you so much.
writing, nor did he ever personally receive any
I'm still I'm still laughing that your wife is like, why do you have Discord and you delete it? That is I was thinking about it the other day. I'm like laughing about like that conversation, how it went.
Success or recognition for the small amount he did. He died believing that his work wasn't any good. On his deathbed, he even instructed Max Brod to burn all of his unpublished manuscripts following his death.
Okay, so I don't agree with this sentiment. I think it's a much more mixed bag that Kafka basically he thought he was a good writer, but he didn't have the courage to put himself out there. And you can see that in you can see that in The Hunger Artist. I'll tell the story now that I said I was going to tell earlier. So Kafka died of tuberculosis, and I don't know much about tuberculosis, but I know this story. Um, And basically, his throat was closing, and he could no longer eat, and he died of starvation. Very terrible way to go out. Tuberculosis was once one of the most deadly diseases ever. I don't know if it still is, but very bad, and it sucks that it took out somebody so genius that wasn't quite recognized. But really, the last story he writes is called The Hunger Artist, and I'm kind of going to spoil it, but I've never seen this interpretation anywhere else. I don't think I stole this from it. I think this is my own interpretation, but basically at the end of the Hunger Artist, this guy his art is fasting, and it used to draw great crowds, and slowly over time less and less people care, and as less and less people care he gets paid less and less, and he's basically put in this cage with like a panther in it, and they forget about him. And in his dying moments he asks the guy like, how many days have I done this? And he realizes he broke his record, and like he kind of dies fulfilled. And really, what this symbolizes to me is Kafka's editing this on his deathbed, really. And what this symbolizes to me is that Kafka created art for the sake of art. He doesn't need the recognition of others because he did it. And he knows he's done it, and he knows it allowed him to express something that he otherwise couldn't express. Ephesians 6:12, we not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. It's a great quote.
Obviously, Brod did not follow Kafka's instructions, because here we are, 100 years later, talking about him. After Kafka died, Brod spent the following year or so working to organize and publish his notes and manuscripts. Over the decade following, Kafka would become one of the most prominent literary and philosophical figures of the 20th century. In other words, one of the greatest writers and thinkers of the century lived his life with his work buried in some drawer, aware, unaware.
That's so crazy to think. Like, just, looking, I don't know how much Kafka's I don't like, it would probably be hard to track how much he's grown in his entire lifetime. Like, actually, not his lifetime, in his death, like the amount of money. But imagine this is like basically like just a normal desk, and it has like a bank worth of money inside of it, and you didn't see like, it's crazy to me.
Or indifferent to the fact that he was sitting on some of the most significant works in recent history. He lived his life in the eyes of his father, an inadequate disappointment, and yet in the eyes of history, he is an immensely important individual.
So, I don't think he's gonna tell it, but that the most significant story that I've heard about Kafka, his father like locked him outside in the snow for like a few hours when he was very young, and like some people credit this is why he was so sickly. I don't necessarily believe that's the case, but like his father basically wanted him to become the success he couldn't be. And Kafka could never live up to his father's standard because he was very big, very strong. He was this great businessman. He could deal with people. Whereas Kafka was kind of more reserved. He was kind of more to himself. He didn't quite have the same qualities. And his entire life, he felt like a failure because he couldn't live up to this standard. He couldn't live up to this impossible standard. And a great way to see this relationship in action is to read The Judgment by Kafka. That's really a story about not living up to your father's standards and being destroyed by your father's image of who he wants you to be. Fasting is a race to death. Whoever stops wins, whoever dies.
One can only wonder how many individuals like Kafka have and continue to walk this earth, completely disconnected or restricted from ever seeing who they really
Can't
are
take
or
any money
could
with
be.
you. His
How many
ideas are worth
Kafkas
winning.
have lived and died without ever
Well, yeah,
sharing
but
them or
I was thinking about it in terms of like Imagine if he had known, like he said, burn everything I wrote. Imagine if he knew how valuable that thing was. Like
with the world
it's
whose
cool to
voice
think.
would have changed it forever. How many people never know who they'll be after they're gone? Fortunately for everyone other than Kafka, his work was saved and an entirely new genre of thinking and writing developed in his name, Kafkaesque. Generally, the term Kafkaesque tends to refer to the bureaucratic nature of capitalistic judiciary and
No, that Kafka-esque is you read a story and you know it's Kafka. It's not, doesn't have to do with capitalism, doesn't have to do with bureaucratic. It doesn't, it's a bleak world where things are far more sinister than they appear, where you don't know the difference between fiction and fact, where things just happen and they happen in the most unexpected way and they destroy you. That's Kafkaesque. I always hate when people put like a modern spin on these ideas. It's not, don't put your isms on these ideas. I think it really limits it. Shoveling snow is good for your soul. Father putting all his volumes. Yeah. And it sucks too, because there's so many people that live in that shadow. I mean, this is really the Freudian idea of the Oedipus complex.
government systems, the sort of complex, unclear processes in which no one individual ever really has a comprehensive grasp on what is going on, and the system doesn't really care. But the
It's not like there's so much more to Kafka than just his political I don't get what this guy's
quality
saying.
of Kafkaesque also seems to extend much further than this. He's not
He's gonna talk about the
necessarily exemplified
metamorphosis,
merely
which
by
really
what these
isn't.
systems are, but rather the reaction of the individual subjected to them and what it might represent. In one of his most famous novels, The Trial, the protagonist Joseph K. is suddenly arrested at his home one morning. The officers do not
This is my favorite work by Kafka, by the way.
inform K of why he's being arrested, though, and he's then forced through a long, absurd trial in which nothing is ever really explained or makes much sense. The trial is riddled with corruption and disorderliness, and by the end of the novel, after having meandered the entire thing, K is never told why he was arrested, and yet he remains guilty of his final conviction. In another one of his more popular stories, Metamorphosis, the protagonist Gregor Samsa awakes into having suddenly been turned into an insect with no clear explanation.
So this story, if you haven't read anything by Kafka, this would be the first thing that I suggest you read because if you read this, you don't need to read anything else by Kafka. You know his style, you know what he's writing about. You kind of get a feel for who he was and the things that he liked to talk about. That doesn't mean you should stop with that, but like if you want to read one thing and be done with Kafka, it's that. That's the first thing I always recommend to people because I think it's up there with the best of his work. To me, I just like the trial a little bit more. But to me, what this idea symbolizes is do people care about us or do they care about what we can do for them? Because as he's turned into a human beetle hybrid, basically his family kind of locks him away. He's hidden. They can't stand the sight of him. They can't even look at him. And like you could either see this as like a H.P. Lovecraftian tale, or you could see this as a somewhat allegory to our mortality and, when we're no longer useful to the people around us, do they still give us the same respect?
The first and recurring issues Gregor faces throughout the novel are the problems of getting to work, dealing with his boss, and providing financially for his inconsiderately needy family. Gregor, of course, cannot do this. He is a bug, and so he experiences increased dread trying to deal with his situation while becoming a useless nuisance to his family. In both stories, the protagonists are faced with sudden, absurd circumstances. There are no explanations, and in the end, there is no real chance of overcoming them. They are
I think it's almost better that there's no explanations because most books would try to explain these things away and get away from the interesting aspects of this. Grow little boys that grow into broken men. All these stories and histories just feel like the story of us, the dysfunction of the first 25 years of human. Gets easier unless it doesn't. Yeah. No, I'd have to agree. People are either broken by their circumstances or overcome it. You know, as Nietzsche says, amor fati, love your fate. Love everything that happens to you because it builds you to be strong enough to face the challenges of tomorrow.
Are outmatched by the arbitrary, senseless obstacles they
I guess
face,
the
in
Stoics said
part
it, but
because they can't understand or control any of what is happening. The crux of Kafka's style and work seems to be carried by this confrontation with the absurd, a conflict in which a character's efforts, reasoning, and sense of the world are met with inescapable parameters of senselessness, wherein success is both impossible and, in the end, ultimately pointless, and yet they try anyway. It's fair to argue that one interpretation is that these circumstances are emblematic of Kafka's take on the human condition, specifically the unyielding desire.
again, I think people read too deeply into Kafka and think it's this bleak worldview. Obviously, surface level, it's bleak, but like, I think it's really what you do with it. And the fact that we have the story of Kafka laughing, like, I think it's not as serious as we take it to be. I think it's more so pointing out the ridiculousness of everyday life and the ridiculousness of toiling and trying anyway, and kind of an ending of acceptance. That's to me what really is the genius of Kafka.
For answers in conquest over the existential problems of anxiety, guilt, absurdity, and suffering, paired with an inability to ever really understand or control the source of the problems and effectively overcome them. But the kicker and perhaps most important part is, even in the face of absurd, despairing circumstances, Kafka's characters don't give up. At least initially, they continue on and fight against their situations, trying to reason, understand, or work their way out of the senselessness. But in the end, it is ultimately to no avail. Perhaps in this, Kafka is suggesting that the struggle to find solace in understanding is both inescapable and impossible. As conscious, rational beings, we fight against the absurdity, trying to resolve.
And this is like, wow, the world is hard. Like, it's not really the genius of Kafka. It's just the way he's able to put it and the way he's able to just display it is unlike anything else you've ever seen. It's not like you can go on Reddit and you could see people just talking about how bad the world is, but the way Kafka does it, he's able to describe reality in a manner that is just so poignant and so perfect that you're like, he's got a point there.
The discrepancy between us and the universe. But ironically, we only serve to self perpetuate the very struggle we are trying to resolve by trying to resolve the unresolvable. And in this sense, on some level, we almost want the struggle. Of course, this is just one interpretation. Ultimately, because of its vague, surreal, and inexplicable quality, Kafka's work lends itself to nearly as many interpretations as readers. Perhaps the idea is that we should accept our absurd condition and not take it so seriously. Perhaps the
Yeah,
idea
and
is that we should.
that's more so my take, but that could also just like he said, that could be my worldview as a whole and the way I view things because that's who I am as a person. Um, I don't know. I always like to see whenever I approach a philosophical system, whenever I approach an idea, I like to think of the ends. How does this serve me? How does this benefit me? How does this allow me to rationalize life in a way that is beneficial to me? I mean, is this Marcus Aurelius that says this? Something along the lines of like philosophy allows you to deal with the hardships of life, the way you can think about things. Maybe that's Plato. I can't remember who said that, but that's the way I like to approach these sorts of ideas. What can I change about my current state of thinking that can benefit me from this? So maybe that lean in some way fixes my judgment to only see the positive.
And must struggle against it. Or perhaps the idea is that we can't know what the idea is. In truth, only Kafka will ever have known exactly what his work meant, and it's fair to speculate that in some sense, perhaps not even him. What is undeniable, though, is that Kafka's work has left a lasting impact on literature, philosophy, and humanity at large. It has helped readers around the world feel less alone in their own hunches of truth and moments of Kafkaesque experiences. Kafka's own story is not necessarily unusual. His father, although cruel, his life, although sad, neither were nor are all that uncommon. To be born in
And I think that's the I mean, obviously this is every great story, but there's like a universal element that Kafka's able to express uh, a clear way. As Hypnodio said, we're all little boys that grew into broken men and tried to pick the pieces together. Like that's why Kafka resonates. That's why Nietzsche resonates. That's why Emerson resonates. That's why Dostoevsky resonates because it speaks to a underlying aspect of humanity that is ever present but is not being fulfilled by your daily life. Wow, you're Hypnodio, you're gonna make fun of me. Colossians. How do you say that? Give me the phonetic spelling. Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Tremendous quote.
into a faulty family, bad place in the world, or a weak body or brain, to live and die having never recognized one's full potential.
Hypnodio, have you ever read The Divine Comedy? I think that was something I was gonna pick up soon. I wonder what you think about it. Or William Blake. Wonder if I don't know if I've asked this too.
To have been stuck in a bureaucratic cog of a business organization or government system, to have felt the guilt and anxiety of existence for no clear reason. We've all, at least at times, experienced the Kafkaesque. Kafka's work is not considered great because it describes something profoundly unique, but because it describes something mundanely common in a profound way. An encapsulation of an often indescribable experience, a part of life that touches us all. When referring to Kafka, writer Anne Rice once said that his work helped her realize the following approach in her own work.
I'm done with this video. I don't know what this is. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is love, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Yes, I have to agree with that. All right, I think that's a perfect place to end that. I got some things I want to go do. Like I said earlier, I'm gonna be back streaming more often. I don't know why I stopped. It's so fun, and there's so many good videos out there like this that um, I think allow me to go much deeper into topics. Otherwise, I would just go all over the place on different tangents, and I think it's very beneficial to like me at least when I can have like somewhat streamlined, somewhat focused of something. Maybe I have to like do PowerPoints. Maybe I have to like find another style of presentation, but that's something for a future date. But Hypnodio, thanks for being here. It's good talking to you. Everyone else that was here, everyone else that's still here, thank you so much for having a great stream. I hopefully will see you guys tomorrow. Love you guys. Peace out. I'll catch you in the next one.